Actually, the best place to start would be to start at lung 1, right? This is essentially where we started. And if you recall, we should find lung 2 before we find lung 1. Lung 2 is really easy to find, right? You can come up to the clavicle and see the lower border of the clavicle. You can palpate for the anterior border of the deltoid, and we already see this little deltopectoral triangle forming. You've got your pec coming down like so. So right in the center, right in the hollow of that deltopectoral triangle is not lung 1, but lung 2. Lung 1 is going to be below it. This is referred to as our 6th Sun line, right? We're not 4, as in halfway through the clavicle for the stomach channel. We're not 2 for the kidney. We are 6. So we're right essentially at the end of that clavicle in this big open space, the deltopectoral triangle. Following the border of the anterior deltoid, we're going to palpate downwards until hopefully we can define the space between our ribs, our first intercostal space. If I wiggle my finger in here, I should be able to feel the first rib above it and the second rib below it, and that'll make me in the first rib space. If I can't really, if I'm not really certain that I'm in a rib space and I'm pressing in here, we have a well-developed pec or what have you, I can't feel that rib space, I can always go back to that first method that I told you about palpating rib spaces. Come back to the medial aspect of the clavicle, roll your finger immediately inferior to it, and if I press inwards, if I press in a posterior direction, I should be on bone, right? If I'm at the medial aspect of the clavicle, immediately below it, my finger is over bone. And so then I need to go a little bit further, and it's much easier to palpate our intercostal spaces closer to the sternum. So now I really have my finger in that first intercostal space, and you can then follow it outwards until you finally reach that first intercostal space, okay? There is a risk of pneumothorax with these points, so typically they are needled towards the shoulder rather than towards the chest, and that sort of helps us mitigate any danger that we might have in causing a pneumothorax or a lung puncture. I'm going to skip down to lung 5 and 9 because, of course, we've got 3 and 4 in this area, but these, of course, this is our 5 shoe point area. This is where the big players are. So finding lung 5 means that we have to find our cubital crease, okay? And we can simply just bend the elbow in order to do that. And much like we did at the knee, we can put our whole finger in that crease in order to palpate the bicep tendon, right? It's called the aponeurosis, but we're palpating for a big ropey tendon right in the dead center pretty much of this cubital crease. Because the lung channel goes down to the thumb, we'll find lung 11 on the thumb. We want to make sure that we're on the radial side of that tendon. So as long as we're in the crease, which we can define with a bend, and we place ourselves just radial to that tendon, we found lung 5, okay, our water point of the lung channel. Then in order to be able to find any other lung point in here, save for 7, which is off the mark, we should skip down to 9. And 9, we need to find our wrist crease by finding heart 7. And heart 7 is what we say is just proximal, or at the proximal border of our pisiform bone. And you should be able to come up into it, that is, press distally so that you can feel the proximal border of that pisiform bone. If that makes any sense. I'm just going to draw sort of an imaginary line there. That's that inferior border of the pisiform bone. And that for us is going to define our line where we're going to end up going over and finding lung 9. On the yin side, we're going to find heart, pericardium in the middle, and lung on the radial side. Okay? Now that we have our dimension this way, or defined our wrist crease, because Tai Yuan lung 9 is at our first pulse position, and because it's so close to our radial artery, we should feel for the pulse before we find lung 9. And lung 9 is located just radial to that radial artery. Okay? So if you can feel the pulse at that crease, you're just going to place that acupuncture point. So I can feel the pulse right here. I'm going to place that acupuncture point right here. That's really not very clear. But very, very close to that radial artery, just on the radial side. Okay? Now that we've got 5 and 9, which I didn't draw 5, but we can just put a little, maybe I should use stickers. Now we have our line for 6 not 7, but then 8 and 9. 8, you should be able to roll over the styloid process of the radius for about 1 sun. Just proximal to the full extent of the styloid process of the radius, you'll find lung 8 on the line connecting 5 and 9. 7 is the tricky one, because 7, Li Qi, or lightning, is off the mark a little bit. And I actually want to come to large 5, or just orient myself in this area. I don't really need to be precise about finding, did I say lung 5? Large 5.
Yeah.
Large intestine 5. If you stick up your thumb for me, we've got, that's a good thing to get on film. Look at that. That big depression in there is called your anatomical snuff box, and that's where we're going to find large intestine 5. If you just relax. Now, with the arm in this position, right, with the thumb up, I can go directly proximal from large intestine 5 and move over the full extent of the styloid process of the radius in this area. And as soon as I fall over that, it's going to be very close to lung 8, but just a little bit more proximal. You can see how close lung 8 and lung 7 are. 7 closer to the large intestine channel, 8 almost level with 7, but back on that lung channel between 9 and 5, okay? 10 we should talk about too, because it's a little bit confusing in the Deadman. It looks like, from the diagram or the image in the Deadman, it looks like he wants you to go through that thenar eminence. And while this is certainly possible, and you'll certainly get there, it's ouchy.
Yeah.
So we like to go to the border of the red and white, that is, find that border of the metacarpal, and midway, please, between where the joint ends on either end, so midway in that thenar eminence, but on the border of the red and white, is how we're going to end up needling into lung 10. Not like this, please, but like this. You get to the same spot. It's just a little bit nicer to tolerate.
You called it medial needling? Or what did you say?
So it's transverse, right? Kind of needling.
Well, technically, actually, if you follow this location, it would be a perpendicular insertion, technically, because perpendicular is any angle of the needle that we're talking about is relative to the surface of the skin. So if we have the skin that's petering this way, but we're needling here, this is still perpendicular. This would be transverse in either direction or oblique. We talk about needle angle in therapeutics and techniques where it's a little bit more relevant, or at least where you start to needle. Okay, so that's lung.